Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to take a look at some inexpensive single-action airbrushes from Harbor Freight, as well as my main airbrush, the Paasche Model H. This is the brush I've been happily using for years now. There are two basic airbrush types, single-action and double-action. The brushes we'll look at today are all single-action. I'll leave some links below that go into greater detail about the differences between the two, but for my purposes, I just wanted a simple airbrush that would lay down an even coat of paint on my small models. And this is what a single-action brush does really well. Push down the button for air and paint. That's it. Sort of like a little aerosol can, but better. Here I'd like to show what I typically use my airbrush for, and that is to simply lay down thin coats of paint, usually acrylic, and sometimes with masking tape on building kits. Now these are all microtrains kits, by the way. I'll also do some light weathering with the airbrush, but most of my weathering is done separately by hand. On this small craft repair building coming up, you can see a little bit of gray at the bottom of the building, and that was applied with an airbrush. Now I could use regular aerosol cans for this type of application, but too many times aerosol paint can splatter, or I can't readily find a color I like, or it just comes out of a can too heavy. Covering up small details with models this size, that's kind of a problem, as detail really is everything. So I was in Harbor Freight recently, and as you do, you buy stuff you don't really need because it's cheap. Now here's a Harbor Freight knockoff of a Badger 350 airbrush. Now this next airbrush is kind of interesting. It's basically the same model, but a slightly older version. You can tell the older packaging and different part number. I've been meaning to try this out, and I thought, well, let's get the newer version and try them both out. Now this last brush kit, well, I had to buy it because it was only $10. I think enough said there. It looks interesting though. And my last Harbor Freight purchase for this visit was an airbrush holder. Now I kind of have something here in my studio that I've rigged up to hold the airbrush, but I thought, again, $10 seems to be the magic number for me. If it's $10 and if it's in Harbor Freight, I'm probably going to buy it. So we have a little airbrush holder, and it looks reasonably sturdy. What can go wrong? This holder can take 4 brushes, and these yellow plastic bits are, I believe, better suited to hold a double-action gravity feed style brush, which I don't currently use. Now these red rubberized hooks up on top work well with siphon brushes that have a paint cup or a paint jar that's lower than the main body of the airbrush. Okay, we've got the preliminary stuff out of the way. Let's look at the brushes. First up is the Paasche H. The red handle is plastic, but the rest of the brush is all metal, and to me, it has a great feel in the hand. I also like the metal quarter-ounce paint cup it comes with. Next up, we have the new version of the Badger 350 copy. Now this comes with a paint jar and a plastic air hose and a few other fittings. One nice thing here is that it can also take the Paasche metal paint cup, which I really prefer over the included paint jar. On small models, you're often only using a very small amount of paint, and the paint cup works really well. And here's the Quick Change Airbrush Kit. This one's interesting as the air and paint nozzles are both exposed. The principle is the same in all these brushes. High air pressure draws the paint from the paint jar or cup, and the paint is then atomized. In this brush, though, it's all done outside the body of the brush. It's kind of cool. Probably the biggest reason to use an airbrush, in my opinion, well, the two biggest reasons, is that you can control the paint flow and atomization for a better finish, and you can use virtually any paint, expensive, inexpensive, really old paint as well. Before I began using an airbrush, I can't tell you how many times a can of spray paint would clog up on me just from sitting around for too long, and a full can of paint would end up in the garbage. What you're seeing on screen now is an extreme example of an old bottle of metal primer, latex metal primer. It's been sitting so long that there's a ton of skin that I'm pulling out, but once this paint was mixed with a little thinner, it went on beautifully through the airbrush. You really don't get that kind of longevity with conventional spray cans. For testing out these airbrushes, I'm using some equally old chalky craft paints, as well as a copper metallic paint. Now looking back, I probably should have used some more gloss paints here, but I always use flat paints for my kits and just did the same for these tests. I'm adding in some Tamiya X20A thinner and mixing with a battery-powered paint mixer. These tests are really just to show how I use my Paasche as more or less a glorified spray can, though a very good one. The way to adjust the paint flow is roughly the same on all these brushes, and that is to adjust the nozzle that delivers the paint, which is what I'm doing right here. The air pressure is then set separately by a compressor adjustment. I normally don't do airbrush work this close to a model, just wanted to get the brush into the camera shot here. Now this is how I use my airbrush most of the time. As I've said before, I look at it as a glorified spray can with just lots more control. I tend to use a fairly high air pressure setting and have the nozzle choked down to keep the paint flow at a minimum. This gives me thin coats to dry very quickly. I'll add a link below in the description to another YouTuber who reviewed the Quick Change airbrush, the one we'll look at in just a minute. He does painting on the backs of plastic spoons, which is where I got this idea. Cool idea. He's got a channel where he presents a lot of great airbrush related info, and it's definitely worth checking out. Here I'm spraying the very flat chalky paint with a low paint flow and a fairly high air pressure. The paint dries quickly, and you can see there's not a lot of overspray happening. Just for the heck of it, I decided to throw a can of Tamiya primer into the mix, or Tamiya primer, I'm not quite sure. Anyway, this aerosol is generally considered to be one of the best spray paints you can buy for model painting. This can of primer sells for just around $13 on Amazon, more than any of our Harbor Freight airbrushes. Here's the paint bottle that comes with the new version of the Harbor Freight Badger 350 clone. Off topic a bit here, but they use some kind of magic glue on these labels. I'd like some of this glue for my car repairs. Look at this stuff. Once cleaned, you can see the size of this bottle compared to the Paasche paint cup. If you do use this Harbor Freight brush, I would recommend picking up one of these paint cups on eBay or Amazon, as I feel they're just more convenient. I found this Harbor Freight brush produced similar results to the Paasche, but didn't quite have the smoothness in the paint flow adjustment. Also, the air hose that came with this kit leaked just a bit around the fittings. Again, I'm definitely biased towards the Paasche, perhaps because I've been using it for so many years and I'm just used to the feel of it. Here's the older version of this Harbor Freight brush. They made a few small design tweaks on the newer version, but this old brush gave me similar results. You can see I'm using the Paasche paint cup here instead of the included paint bottle. This brush, like its newer counterpart, doesn't quite have the same smooth feel as the Paasche, in my opinion, but the results using this copper paint are again pretty similar to the Paasche. Not bad for a $10 brush, even with its slightly leaky hose. We're now on to the Quick Change Airbrush kit. Here's one of the 5 included paint bottles with the adjustable fluid cap. You turn it counterclockwise for maximum paint flow, clockwise for minimum flow. I wish they would have included glass bottles instead of these plastic bottles, but it is a $10 kit after all. The body of this brush is definitely interesting, very lightweight and waffly. And before I began painting, I noticed a pretty strong leak coming from the hose fitting. But the unique feature of this brush is the jar adapter and its quick changeability from color to color. Since no paint ever gets in the body or on the airbrush nozzle, all you'll need to clean after painting are the jars. On my brush, the threads were a little wonky. It almost felt like the air nozzle was cross-threaded. I've seen this brush reviewed by other people on YouTube, so I'm definitely willing to concede that my brush may be a little off, or that I'm just not overly comfortable with this brush style, so I really don't want to knock the brush. It's really important, I think, to keep in mind the price of this brush and what it may be best suited to. I think if I work with it a bit more, I could smooth out some of what I found to be its rough edges. Here's where I think this brush really shines, the fast color changes. Now the plastic parts on the brush and jars mate together pretty well, snapping together with a nice positive feel. With a lower paint flow set on the jar's fluid cap, this copper paint seemed to go on a bit smoother than the previous blue chalk paint. Again, if I work with this brush a bit more, I think I could improve. As a rule, I really don't like blaming a tool for my results. One thing I really don't care for with these paint jars, and that's the cleaning up job. It's made a bit more difficult because they're plastic. This is another reason I prefer brushes that can use a small open paint cup. Now let's look at some spoons. As I mentioned earlier, there's another YouTube channel that did this spoon test using at least one of these Harbor Freight brushes, and I would definitely recommend checking out that channel. I'll leave that link below. The Paasche brush did a nice even job on these spoons, especially on this one, the copper metallic paint. The Tamiya seemed to produce more fuzzies than I'd like, though the humidity was low and the distance to the model was close, so I'm not quite sure why. These next two brushes, the newer and older version of the Harbor Freight Badger 350 clone, both produced pretty solid results, close to being on par with the Paasche. This was kind of a surprise. Pick up a better air hose and a metal paint cup for a few bucks, and this becomes a much better tool for good, basic paint coverage. Finally, the Harbor Freight Quick Change Brush. On the flat colors, it did well. I'd say on par with the Tamiya rattle can, which was a little surprising. On the copper metallic, it got a little blotchy. I do think I could improve, though, with a little practice using this brush. At the end of the day, I simply want my airbrush to give me reliable, even paint, and I think any of these brushes can do just that. My preference is the Paasche, but any of these building kits could have been painted with any of the brushes in this video. So choose your brush and get painting. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our Rail Day channel. Help us grow. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.